Our first panel will set the stage for the afternoon and consider what's ahead for the country. For that, please welcome Dr. Nathaniel Frank. He's an historian and internationally recognized authority on LGBT public policy. He directs the What We Know project at Columbia Law. The project is an online research portal that focuses on pressing public policy debates. And Hayden Mora is the founder and principal of the Parallax Group, a trans-led consulting firm focused on progressive policy change. Here to lead the conversation is my colleague, The Atlantic's Matt Thompson. Take it away, Matt.
Thank you very much, Margaret. And good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Nathaniel and Hayden. So I'm going to start by cribbing from Jonathan Groff's King George and asking a very wide open question. What comes next?
It's very Atlantic of you.
Thank you.
If I had his voice, then that would probably be helpful. Deep sigh, first of all. I think there's so much uncertainty for all of us. I mean, for the country, for the LGBT movement. And the first thing that comes to mind is really sort of, whether you want to call this election a wake-up call or a reminder of some of the priorities and things that people in the movement have been saying for a while, is that there are really vulnerable and really terrified people within the LGBT population. And a Trump presidency is not going to affect us all in the same way. So if you are a white gay man living in New York City, married, financially comfortable, a Trump presidency may not threaten you as a gay person, while it may threaten you in many other ways that you'll share with the country. But if you're a queer youth of color living in a rural area, a lot of people in those situations, much less if you're undocumented, if you're Muslim, if you're Mexican, et cetera, are really, really terrified. And so this is a wake-up call and a reminder for our movement to recognize that there are differing levels of vulnerability within the movement and within the community and within the country, and that we have to band together and take action with that in mind.
So Hayden, you're connected to a lot of discrete components, both within the LGBTQ coalition of activists, but also having worked at SEIU and HRC for many years. What do you see as being the immediate prerogatives as you're making calls to activists that you're connected to? What's tops on the agenda?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that you shared. I've spent the last, as I'm sure many of us have, the evening of the election and then up until a few minutes ago today, on the phone with folks around the country that are just terrified. So I work with a group called Trans United, which is a group of trans folks that are multiracial, economically diverse. They have different HIV status, different class status, and it really is very representative of the community. And people are just terrified. People that I've spoken, the parents of trans kids, trans folks that have undocumented status, there is profound terror in this moment. The thing that I'd say is I think a lot of what we'll talk about today at The Atlantic has lined up an incredible list of subject matter experts to the question of what's next and what I see. I would speak specifically towards the opportunity and the moment that we have right now as a movement and as communities. There's been a long-standing critique, particularly from the most impacted folks in the LGBTQ community, that the majority of the resources that we have as a movement are spent predominantly on the expansion of formal legal equality, which, while crucial, has often ignored the issues of equity, of everyday experience, those things that reach beyond the law and often despite the law. And so the piece that I'd say, and I think I spent 11 years in the labor movement, I got a chance to spend time with the United Mine Workers, and that's where I learned the origin of the phrase, the canaries in the coal mine. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the origin, miners would take caged canaries into the coal mine because they're small and vulnerable, and if there were high levels of toxic gases, the canaries would often seize and die, and that would give the miners time to flee. What I'd say is that many, perhaps most of the LGBTQ community, poor folks, folks of color, trans folks, the undocumented folks living with HIV, we have been dying and we have been living in terror for a long time. And our movement and our communities have not built an infrastructure or a capacity or prioritize the issue of equity and of everyday experience. The difference now is things are about to get much worse for those people, and much worse for a much broader set of us. And I think we have the opportunity to organize in a way that really prioritizes and centers the least among us. And if we do that, then we'll be able to build a coalition, and we'll be able to build power in a way that will benefit all of us. And I just say, I just have a text message from a young leader in Zimbabwe who was part of the, if folks are familiar with what's happening in Zimbabwe, is an undocumented immigrant here. And she wrote to me, she's a young trans woman. She was outed while she was here on a fellowship in the US, outed in Zimbabwe, and had to flee because the militia tried to kill her. She wrote me a few minutes ago, the strategies of surviving the possible outcomes, deportation, detention, torture, pain. I just came from a place where I had fear for my life, and now it's the same situation here. I'm tired of fighting and running. Maybe I should just return home. Maybe the militia will kill me, but at least I'll die at home. And I think that sort of palpable fear is something that so many people are facing.
You mentioned the coalition, and that's one of my questions. Over the past decade, I think as we look back in the aftermath of what you might call steps forward for different parts of the LGBTQ coalition and steps backward, one of the questions that recurs again and again is, what is this coalition? How is it held together? After the passage of Prop 8, right around the time of Obama's election, the same day, there was a lot of recriminations immediately afterwards, finger pointing, who's to blame for this, who didn't put enough feet on the street to get the word out. What do you see as the future of the coalition looking forward in the wake of a moment when you might be facing some steps backward?
Well, the LGBT movement coalition has always been a very fractured bunch, and as with most social movements, but maybe especially, and that's been a strength and a challenge. It's something that I've researched for a book I'm working on the marriage equality battle and how we got there from a period in the 70s, 80s, and 90s when many people within the movement didn't want to prioritize marriage for a number of ideological and strategic reasons. So I think, the bottom line for the moment is, again, we have to stick together. We have to remember, as we've been saying, that there are some among us who are going to be hurting and face challenges that are bigger and scarier than others. But we also have to recognize that we're going to disagree, and then that's okay. We have to create enough unity to get things done at the policy level, to defend things at this point, to continue to shape and change hearts and minds, which is an ongoing and I would say incremental process. And I think recognizing the nature of incremental change is an important part of understanding how social change works. It may be, although I don't see data on this yet, but Trump's win may in some ways represent the limits of change and represent, even though I don't think that many people went to the polls to vote against LGBT progress who tipped him over, it is certainly possible that that there are elements of discomfort and resistance to those changing norms that helped fuel this. And I think we have to be able to look strategically at what the best steps are without confusing that with a sort of moral acceptance of, okay, if we're going to focus on this, that means that we don't care about this issue or these people, because there are sometimes strategic aspects of incremental progress that do actually call for taking some steps and not others, and recognizing just the nature of an incremental change as a reality. So that's, I think, the tough question, is how do you stick together, and how do you make sure that we do what we've been saying about not leaving anyone behind, while also being strategic and realistic about how change happens.
I think that one of the things that has, so first, I don't think there is an LGBTQ movement or an LGBTQIA movement. I think there are movements and there are tensions within those movements. I do think, Trans United, the three of the organizing principles we have is a rejection of sectarianism, a commitment to move beyond self-interest, and a commitment to prioritize issues of equity and to prioritize the most impacted voices. So practically speaking, I do think that sectarianism, the idea that either the only way to go is the approach of the Human Rights Campaign, and anyone else is radical and doesn't understand the system, or the approach of, say, a Get Equal, and anyone that doesn't, support sort of direct action and redefining the narrative is a sellout and accommodationist. I don't think that will work. I think that we need all of these approaches. And I think that, with marriage, for example, in same-sex marriage, we had tremendous debates and fights and a tremendous amount of acrimony in our community. And for me, the idea of focusing on marriage was never problematic in and of itself. For me, the idea of focusing on marriage and stopping there is where we failed. And so what I mean by that is, in labor, we begin by having a conversation about self-interest. There's nothing wrong with self-interest. We begin by talking about wages and benefits. But it's through work together and work across difference that people have a transformative experience and a commitment to one another, and that we're able to use that commitment to go broader and to go beyond that. And so, for example, for trans folks, even before a Trump presidency, trans women of color in some communities are living with rates of HIV that are upwards of 70%. I mean, that is morally unacceptable and practically unnecessary. But when I think about who in our community would better understand that crisis, gay white men that lived through the 80s that are so often, critiqued and demonized as the primary obstacle and roadblock to progress. I can think of no community that more deeply understands what that is like to be surrounded by people who are dying every day, and that it's about to get worse. But we need to figure out how to have those conversations and to mobilize. The one thing that I will say is that although it is important, I think, to value all of the different approaches, that the history of our movement is a history of valuing the most privileged. Trans Day of Remembrance is in just a couple of days. There is an epidemic of violence against trans women of color. Right now, there are trans folks. There's a young trans man named Ricardo sitting in a detention center in Arizona who has been raped and assaulted, and nothing is being done. Yes, we need to embrace the different approaches, but we need to build a movement that takes seriously the issues of equity and centers those issues and resources those issues and prioritizes those lives, or we're going to lose so many folks in the next couple of years.
So this introduces or comes back to a tension that Nathaniel raised. I think one of the most significant events of this year was the tragedy that happened in my former hometown, Orlando, at the Pulse nightclub. And it's a reminder, most of our conversation for the first part of this afternoon will be about policy and activism. But there's another front here of hearts and minds, of what you might call social change, that is possibly just as, if not more, important. Nathaniel raised this matter of the question that comes up again and again in the history of civil rights activism in the US, at least going back to slavery and probably beyond, of whether the changes that we've seen over the past decade, the legal and judicial successes that certainly the LGB parts of the LGBTQ coalition have had, whether those are too much, too quickly, whether that record of success wouldn't in fact spur a backlash. And do you think that we're seeing some of that now?
As I said, I think it's certainly possible that reaction to discomfort with the pace of change of new norms for some sectors of the country, I think that may have played into what's going on, but I don't have data on it, so I don't quote me. That's possible.
I think they're going to quote you, just to be
That's
totally
why
honest.
I say it. I'm being
Yeah.
coy.
Yeah.
But I think the hearts and minds aspect is always critical, and it's why first of all, a piece I actually wrote for the Atlantic was about.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great. Was about homophobia going underground as polite and official society made it more and more unacceptable at a pretty quick pace over the last 10 years. It was clear through a number of indicators and common sense that there was still a lot of it out there, and that unlike certain other minorities, that we didn't have the luxury to just get to the 51%, because we didn't have the luxury of just getting the laws and policies changed. We needed to make sure that when queer kids, gender nonconforming kids in the middle of Idaho, or for that matter in rural Pennsylvania or New York, because this was a rural-urban split, I think more than anything else, that when they find themselves being queer, they're usually growing up in households that are with straight and cis parents. And so we have to do a 50-state solution. We have to put our resources and our strategy into making sure that the entire world, frankly, continues to understand what it really means to be queer. So that's always been a fact, and I think we did lose sight of that, some of us, in kind of assuming that, well, we're on the brink of victory. We have the military, we have marriage, we have legal equity, and it is too easy to lose sight of the fact that some of the problems, some of the intolerance lingers and is underground, and the fact that Hearts and Minds is an ongoing incremental process that's critical.
Hayden, I want to ask quickly, one of the things that you mentioned was the need to put front and center the most vulnerable, the most marginalized members of the groups that we're discussing here today. I think one of the splits within the equality movement of certainly like much longer than the past decade. Nathaniel, you're writing a book about this, so you know. One of the splits was this question of which direction do we go, making a case for equality, fairness, and rights, or making a case that we are just like you, that we're virtually normal, to borrow Andrew Sullivan's phrase.
Oh, Andrew Sullivan. Let's see here.
I guess, how do you think about now, given the number of both fronts that are in motion at the moment, how do you think about the task ahead and winning Hearts and Minds, if that's one of the first tasks?
Yeah, and I think, to this, going back to the question, I think that broadly, not exclusively, but broadly on the left, we have to talk about our failures. And how that has, whether it's in the labor movement or whether it's in the LGBTQ movement, et cetera. And what I mean by that is, and you see it sort of in the post-election analysis, you see it manifesting, which is to say, we all have our own particular lens and our own particular analysis. This election was either predominantly about misogyny, it was predominantly about race, or it was predominantly about class. Very few of our movements, very few of our thought leaders, movement leaders, and even fewer of those with infrastructure and resources have in a serious way held all of those things together. I think that to this backlash, I think part of what has happened is, poor and working class white folks have been devastated by shifts in the economy, by changes in this country, and nobody, including the Democrats who were supposed to be standing up for them, took those voices seriously because the electoral math said that we didn't have to anymore. And in that silence, where the Democratic Party and the left broadly failed to prioritize those lives and failed to offer solutions, the right stepped in. The far right of the Klan and talk radio to the respectable right of the Cato Institute and the Republican Party. And in implicit and explicit ways, those folks said, your life matters. We see you, we care. And they offered them an explanatory framework for what was happening. And the explanatory framework that they offered said, you know who to blame? Black folks, queers, immigrants, etc. And so they have been inundated with an analysis and an explanatory framework to make sense of the tremendous fear and pain they're experiencing, and we have been completely absent. I think that we need to change that. And the other thing that I would say is that in the professionalization of the movement and who makes decisions, it is predominantly the most privileged among us. It's not the folks who die first. There's the deputy chief of staff at HRC, a member of the executive team, the only trans person that's ever been in that sort of leadership role. I'm white, I'm middle class, and I'm a man. And we need to change who the decision makers are and who the leaders are. We've had this sort of professionalization and segmentation of how we address each of these oppressions. And so, if you look at the media and the depictions that we put forward of gay and lesbian people, for example, it is predominantly white, middle class, gender binary folks that others can relate to. And all of that work, while we advanced the cause of marriage, which was crucial, we failed to address the broader issues of race, of class, of the other things that impact all of us. And we have an opportunity to do that differently now.
I'm going to turn to you all for a question in just a moment, but before I do, so I mentioned, Nathaniel, that you're working on a history of the marriage equality movement. I'm curious, just limiting to the past 8 years, there have been a lot of different touch points in activism. From last year, we sat together at the LGBTQ summit talking about the failure of Houston's equal rights ordinance 8 years ago, Proposition 8. What do you think are the biggest lessons that you take away from the past 8 years, Nathaniel?
Well, it's very mean to limit a historian to the past 8 years because we sort of scoff and call that sociology.
Sorry. Got it for creative constraints.
That's what we're talking about. We need all the disciplines, convergence.
Right, no, right.
Don't hate
Absolutely,
the
you're right. No, and to your point, there is, in the way I tell the story, there is something of a turning point in 2004 or so when enough people came together in enough ways to say, marriage equality, notwithstanding all of our reservations about it, again, for ideological reasons, strategic reasons, for reasons that associate marriage with privilege and so on, is important enough to get done for a number of reasons that we're all going to work on this together, even though we continue to, now, not all, literally, and that's an important caveat. It's also true that in order for us to get there, there was this extraordinary push and pull of outsiders or grassroots activists on the one hand, and what had become the established sort of official movement. And it's very often the case, even though the marriage equality movement ultimately was steered largely by professionals in the movement, particularly lawyers, it was put on the map by outsiders, and it was kept on the map by outsiders and grassroots activists, often against the wishes and against without the support of the mainstream movement. So you often see that coming from the outside in, and outsiders and grassroots activists have to jump up and down to be heard by some, and to move some of these larger organizations within the movement, as well as the government itself. So I think that's an important dynamic to keep in mind.
The only very quick thing I would add is there's that push and pull between outsiders and insiders, and yet there has also been in the last 8 years and beyond, the largest swaths of our community, of folks that have been, being subjected to violence, subjected to deportation, living lives defined by fear and terror that have not even been on the map of that conversation, that have been outside the outsiders. And I think that to have a chance in this moment, we have to center those voices, and we have to hold all of our organizations accountable to that.
We have a question out here.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. Matthew Savellis here. I'm representing myself. My question is, what is, and I'm sure there aren't a whole ton of people who listen to Donald Trump on that damn podium at the Republican National Convention, but he made interesting comments regarding gay people, made everybody sort of like, I'm glad we're all like cool with gay rights all of a sudden. And what's interesting to me is this an opportunity for the gay rights movement, if you will, or for hell, any of these issues, to hold his feet to the fire and say, hey, you sound like a partner. Let's sit down at the table and have that chat. What do you guys think about that and the possibility as an opening for everything from ENDA to other issues that we're trying to achieve? Is there really anything about our agenda that is just not comporting with what how he's promised to be a friend of gay and lesbian people?
Hayden, let's start with you.
Well, I think that there's a lot of very thoughtful, smart strategy in him saying that, and I think it is in part an organizing tactic to actually attempt to peel us off from one another. And I would say, well, I think that progress has been marked largely, I'd say, for gay and lesbian folks. I think bisexual folks, intersex folks, trans folks, all of these communities, have been marginalized. I think that that is a thoughtful and strategic attempt to set up a dynamic where we are peeled off from one another. And I think that we need to be really thoughtful and do the work within our community of making sure that that doesn't happen.
I absolutely agree with that. I think that while it can seem tempting, first of all, there isn't going to be any move at the federal level on non-discrimination. It was stalled under Democratic control. Installed for 40-some years. Now is not the time it's going to get going. So we do have to be realistic about some of these things. But more to the point, I would echo what Hayden is saying.
I love when historians echo what I say.
You nailed it. And this is the moment to understand what solidarity means. That's and right. Sure, I don't want to get moralistic about it. If there are gains that we can expand on or protect that are LGBTQ specific, then of course we should do that. And I do think that Donald Trump doesn't have a vendetta for the moment against the LGBT community for whatever reason. he seems to have not gone after the gays or the Jews. And so am I supposed to say, oh, great, I'm safe? No. I mean, I'm supposed to say and do strongly feel this is an effort to, or at least will have the impact, could have the impact of peeling away coalition. By the way, I can see that that's what the right wing is doing already. You can see that when you hear Giuliani and Gingrich speak, if you can manage not to turn off the TV and throw things at it, that they are trying explicitly to divide what they call the far left from, I guess, other liberals, and we can't let them do that.
And I'd say that by going after the Muslims and going after immigrants and going after Black lives, they have already come for us, and we need to stop pretending or imagining that is untrue. We are those communities, and that is a part of our community that is most vulnerable.
Hayden, Nathaniel, thank you very much, and look forward to this afternoon. Thank you.